I moved into the old clapboard house on the edge of town in late autumn, thinking the place would be quiet, that the hills and woods surrounding it would be my own private escape from the noise of life. The previous owner had left in a hurry, they said, and the town had been murmuring about the house ever since. I didn't mind. A little local gossip never bothered me. The first night I settled in, unpacked a few boxes, and tried to ignore the creaks of the old wooden floors. That's when I noticed it, a single window in the neighboring house, left wide open. The glass was thin and worn, and even from a distance I could see the shadows of curtains swaying, though no wind touched them. I told myself it was just a forgotten habit of someone who didn't care for closing up properly. I didn't think much of it at first. Over the next few nights, I began noticing subtle things I couldn't explain. Sometimes I thought I saw movement behind that window, a fleeting silhouette just at the edge of the glass. It might have been my imagination, shadows playing tricks on tired eyes, I reasoned. But one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned a bruised orange, I saw her. She was standing there, perfectly still, staring at me. Her eyes were hollow and unblinking, and for the briefest moment I felt my chest tighten, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I could feel her gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I froze, unsure whether to wave, to speak, or to look away. Something about her made me feel wrong for even breathing, like my presence in that yard had been noted and judged. The following days were worse. I caught glimpses of her behind curtains when I wasn't looking directly at the window, the faint, unmistakable scent of lavender drifting through the air at odd times. I began locking doors more diligently, checking the corners of rooms for shadows that weren't mine. Doors would creak as though someone had passed through them, though the house was empty. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that old houses made noises, and the human mind clings to stories when it's lonely. But there was a certainty in her presence I couldn't ignore, a knowledge of me that felt invasive, like the walls themselves were conspiring. I remember one night vividly. I woke to a soft, deliberate tapping on my bedroom window. My heart hammered, and the sound seemed almost too precise to be the wind. My hands shook as I reached for the bedside lamp, illuminating the room in a dull orange haze. When I finally dared to look, she was there, closer than ever, pressed against the glass. The eyes that had seemed hollow before now felt accusatory, as if I had trespassed into a world I didn't belong to. I wanted to run, to escape into the woods behind my house, but my body refused. Something in her gaze rooted me to the floor, to the mattress, to the moment itself. She didn't speak, and yet I understood. She had been waiting, watching, knowing. After that night, I closed the window and kept it shut, refusing to glance toward her house. But the knowledge of her presence lingered, like a shadow draped across the yard. Even with curtains drawn, I felt her eyes, an unshakable weight pressing down from the next property. I noticed small things changing around me. The subtle sway of curtains at night, the faint smell of lavender on the breeze when no one else was outside. It was as though she had claimed the space around me without leaving a footprint, shaping reality in some small, terrifying way. The town murmured about the widow who lived in the old house, though I never asked her name. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, sometimes warning me not to make noise at night, other times dismissing her as eccentric, harmless. But I didn't need to hear their stories. I had seen her and she had seen me. The way she watched, patient and unyielding, felt like a reminder of the small, inescapable truths of living in a place so quiet, so contained. It wasn't about ghosts or spirits. It was about someone who knew your habits, your rhythms, your quietest thoughts. Weeks passed, though it felt longer, as if time itself slowed in the shadow of her watch. I tried to go about my daily life, tending the yard, unpacking boxes, pretending I hadn't glimpsed her through the glass. But at night, my dreams carried her eyes, unblinking and hollow, following me through the empty halls of the house. I would wake in the pre-dawn hours, heart racing, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I never saw her move, never caught her leaving the house or entering, but the sense of presence never left. Sometimes I imagined she was simply sitting there, behind that window, counting my breaths, marking my movements. Eventually, I stopped looking out altogether. I avoided the side of the house facing hers, avoided stepping onto the porch at dusk when shadows stretched long and the air grew thick. Yet I never felt truly safe. Some nights, the faint scent of lavender would drift under my door, a soft, mocking reminder that she was there. Watching. Waiting. Knowing. Even when I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, the evidence was in the small, subtle changes around me. A door slightly ajar when I was certain I had locked it, the sound of floorboards creaking in patterns I didn't recognize, the faint swaying of curtains as if in greeting. She had made her presence known without ever crossing the line, and that line was mine to respect or fear. I moved eventually, leaving the clapboard house behind. I told myself it was for practical reasons, the old plumbing, the drafty rooms, but deep down I knew it was because I could no longer bear the invisible weight of her gaze. I left the window closed, left the curtains drawn, and never returned. But even now, years later, I feel the memory of her eyes in quiet moments. When I pass a window at dusk, when the air carries a soft, floral scent, or when the wind rattles the shingles of a distant house. She is there still, somewhere in that Appalachian town, waiting for whoever dares to look out too long. Some neighbors are better left unseen, some eyes too patient, too knowing. And sometimes, it's not the wind or the creaking floors that keep you awake. It's the certainty that someone has been watching, and they aren't done yet. I moved into that little rental house on the far end of Briar Hollow Road because I wanted quiet. After years of bouncing between towns, I thought a place tucked beneath the Appalachian ridgelines would give me a chance to breathe. The road had only 4 houses on it, spaced far enough apart that you could pretend you didn't have neighbors if you wanted to. The nights were long, the cicadas loud, and the mountains swallowed the last bit of daylight faster than anywhere I'd ever lived. But the peace I thought I'd found didn't last long. Not once I noticed the lights. My closest neighbor lived directly across from me, in a squat one-story house with a sagging porch and peeling green paint. I rarely saw anyone go in or out, and the place looked abandoned half the time. But every evening, right as the sun dipped behind a ridge, the porch lights would flicker on. Not in a smooth glow like normal bulbs, but in short, uneven bursts. Flicker, pause, flicker flicker, long pause. At first, I figured it was bad wiring or maybe a loose connection, something that would burn out eventually. But the longer I watched them, the more I noticed a pattern, like the lights were responding to something I wasn't seeing. The flickering grew faster when I paused outside to take in the evening air, as though the house was acknowledging me. When I walked closer to the end of my driveway, they would dim, then brighten, as if reacting to my presence. I told myself I was overthinking it. Long workdays and quiet nights can make a person read too much into things. But something about those lights pulled my attention every time dusk settled over the valley. They almost felt aware, pulsing like a heartbeat. Some nights I tried to ignore them, keeping my eyes low as I locked up or took out the trash, but that flickering always crept into my peripheral vision, tugging at me. Then, one evening I saw a shape on the porch. It was right after sundown, when the sky still had that pale blue fading into gray. The lights were flickering in their usual rhythm when I noticed something hunched near the far post of the porch. It swayed, slowly, almost like breathing, and for a long second I thought it might have been a person. But something about how still it held itself, how stiff the shape was, made the hair on my arms rise. I blinked, and the figure seemed to fold into the shadows, swallowed by them. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting to see movement, a shift, anything that would confirm it was a trick of my eyes. But nothing happened. Only the lights continued their strange pulse, dimming and brightening like a silent signal. I shook it off. Appalachian twilight had a way of twisting shapes, turning harmless things into unsettling ones if you stared too long. But then the notes began. The first one appeared on my doorstep the next morning, a torn scrap of paper, edges soft and worn, with the words barely visible. You shouldn't watch. The handwriting was jagged, shaky, like someone wrote it in a hurry or with unsteady hands. There was no signature, no explanation. I checked the road, the yard, even the tree line, but everything was still. I tucked the note into my pocket and tried to convince myself it was a prank. Maybe some kid thought it'd be funny. But the next night brought another flickering pattern. Faster this time, more frantic. And I swear the lights seemed to focus on me, like they pulsed brighter when I stepped outside and dimmed when I retreated inside. 2 days later, another note appeared. Go inside. This one was damp, edges smudged. I didn't want to keep it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. The messages felt like warnings, not threats, though I couldn't explain why. Something in the wording, plain, simple, felt like someone trying to help. I tried asking around town about the neighbor. Nobody seemed to know much. A few people shrugged, saying someone lived there off and on, but nobody had seen a person on that porch in months. One old man at the general store told me, without looking up from the counter, "Best keep to yourself on Briar Hollow after dark." When I pressed him, he only repeated it, slower. Those lights became a part of my evenings whether I wanted them to or not. I'd catch myself peeking through the blinds, watching them flicker in their strange pattern. The more I watched, the more it felt like communication, like someone was trying to tell me something without stepping outside. My curiosity grew until one night I couldn't take it anymore. The sky was deep blue, nearly black, when I stepped off my porch and walked across the road. The lights reacted immediately. They flickered fast, nearly strobing, then slowed into a steady pulse. My heart hammered, but the house felt like it was drawing me in, beckoning. I was close enough to see the dust gathering on the porch boards, the sag in the railing, the dead leaves caught in corners. No movement, no voices, no sign of life. But the light stayed steady, almost patient. I took another step. As I reached the bottom stair of the porch, they dimmed. Not all the way, just slightly, like a breath being held. A warning or an acknowledgement, I couldn't tell. "Hello," I whispered, feeling ridiculous. The porch was empty. No figure. No sound except the wind moving through the trees behind the house. Still, the lights pulsed. Slow, rhythmic. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, a long hollow sound that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. The air felt heavier up there, colder. I walked toward the nearest window, cautious and curious in equal measure. The lights flickered again, this time sharper, more urgent. When I leaned closer to look through the glass, something pressed against the inside of the window pane. I didn't see a face. I didn't see hands. Just a sudden pressure, a shift in the dark behind the glass, nudging outward, as though something inside the house pressed back when it sensed me there. The movement was wrong. It was too close, too immediate, too deliberate. The porch lights flared bright, then plunged into darkness. That broke me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping on the steps, and then I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my own porch and slammed the door behind me. I locked it, then locked it again, then sat in the kitchen with the lights off for what felt like an hour listening. Across the road, the porch lights flickered back on. Slow, soft, almost relieved. That was my breaking point. The next day, I began packing. I told myself I just didn't like the mountains, or I missed town living, or the road was too quiet. But deep down, I knew it was because the lights were watching me. Because something inside that house was aware of me. Because the notes, whoever left them, knew something I didn't. On my last morning there, as the moving truck idled in my driveway, I found one final note wedged under my doormat. It said only, "Thank you for leaving." No signature. No explanation. I never returned to Briar Hollow Road. But sometimes, in those late hours when the world is quiet and the dark feels just a little too close, I think about that porch and the way those lights seemed alive. I tell myself I imagined it, that isolation does strange things to the mind. But every now and then, I'll pass a house with a flickering bulb on its porch, and a chill runs through me. I first noticed the shadows not long after moving into that house on the bend of Ridgetop Lane, a narrow strip of holler where the trees grew too close and the fog clung to the ground like it had nowhere else to go. My backyard ended at an old white picket fence, one of those weathered, half-rotten kinds that looked more decorative than useful. Beyond it was my neighbor's property, though I rarely saw anyone over there. Sometimes the house looked lived in, sometimes abandoned, and the whole place felt like it existed in a strange in-between, half forgotten by time. The first night I saw them, I had stepped outside to smoke. The air was cool, and the woods behind the houses were just melting into darkness. That's when I noticed something move beyond the fence line. Not a quick movement like a deer or stray dog. This was slower, more deliberate. A shape, tall and thin, standing just past the last slat of the fence. At first, I thought it was the neighbor, a trick of the failing light making them appear stretched out and strange. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. The figure didn't sway with the breeze. It didn't shift weight. It just existed there, still and tall, like the absence of light had taken on the shape of a person. I blinked and it vanished. I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Long days and lonely evenings will do that. But the next night, it happened again. Same shape, same stillness. This time, there were two of them, side by side, the fence cutting off their lower halves. When I looked away and back, only one remained. A cold prickle ran up my spine, the kind that makes your instincts tighten before your mind has a chance to catch up. Things escalated from there. It was around midnight when I heard it. Soft scraping, like claws or nails dragging slow across wood. At first, I thought it was a raccoon, but the sound was too measured, too careful. The scrape would glide for a second, then stop, then resume again from another spot. It circled the fence, moving from slat to slat as though testing each one quietly. I grabbed a flashlight, though a part of me didn't want to see anything at all, and stepped outside. The beam caught nothing at first. Then, when I moved closer, I heard a low breathy exhale, human, or close enough to it that my chest went tight. I pressed my eye to a gap in the fence. A figure crouched on the other side, close enough that I could see the curve of its shoulders and the faint outline of limbs drawn close to its body. It was watching me. I couldn't see its face, only a deeper patch of darkness where its features should have been, but I could feel it staring. I didn't breathe. Neither did it. That stillness became unbearable, and when I finally flinched back, the scrape resumed, this time faster, almost eager. I backed into my house and locked the door, waiting for the sound to fade. The next morning, I went out to check the fence. The wood was scarred, thin, deep grooves dragged along the slats in a way that didn't match any animal I knew. Whatever had been there wasn't just passing through. It had lingered. Over the following days, strange things began happening inside my house. At first, it was subtle. Doors left slightly ajar when I was certain I'd shut them, lights I didn't remember turning on. Small objects went missing, only to reappear in places I never used. A spoon on the windowsill, a shoe on the back porch, a key tucked under the doormat. I found footprints in the mud near the fence. Narrow, human-like but too elongated, like someone had walked through the yard on the edges of their feet. The steps circled, doubled back, then stopped at the fence as if whoever made them simply vanished into thin air. My neighbor was no help. When I finally got the courage to ask if they'd seen anything strange around their yard, they stared at me with this blank, distant expression, like I'd asked them something they couldn't understand. I pointed out the fence, the marks, the footprints, but they only shrugged and said they rarely went outside at night. Their eyes flicked toward the fence once, just once, with a quiet recognition I didn't know how to read. Not fear, more like resignation. That night, the shadows returned. I kept the lights off in the house, thinking maybe it'd make me less noticeable. But I couldn't stop myself from peeking through the blinds. 3 tall shapes stood beyond the fence this time. They didn't move. They didn't sway. They just watched. I could almost feel their attention pressing against the windows, heavy and unblinking. I didn't know how close they were to the fence anymore. The darkness seemed to swallow the space between us. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the old house felt like someone stepping inside. Every whisper of wind in the trees felt like a breath at my window. My world shrank to the glow of a single lamp and the unending fear that something waited for me to make a mistake, to step outside, to fall asleep, to turn my back. Then something changed. One evening, I stepped into the hallway and saw the back door standing wide open. I hadn't touched it all day. There were muddy prints leading in from the porch, thin, elongated, trailing along the floor and stopping right at the threshold of my bedroom. Nothing else was disturbed. Nothing was taken. It felt like someone had entered just to learn the layout of my home. That night, the scraping at the fence returned. Slow, patient, as if reminding me they were still there. I tried to leave once. Packed a bag, got into my car, told myself I didn't owe anyone an explanation. But the car wouldn't start, dead battery, though it had been fine an hour before. When I stepped back out, the shadows were waiting at the fence again. One of them shifted, just an inch, but enough to tell me it knew I was watching. I stopped trying to leave after that. I don't know what they wanted, still don't. The shadows never crossed the fence, never broke into the house, never did anything outright violent. They didn't need to. They just watched, studied, cataloged in their own silent way. And the longer I lived there, the more I felt myself slipping into that quiet dread, becoming part of whatever routine they held. It felt like being slowly pulled into someone else's world without ever being touched. When I finally moved months later, after finding the courage or maybe the desperation, the shadows didn't try to stop me. They simply weren't there that night. The fence line was empty for the first time since I'd moved in, as though they'd already gotten what they came for. But even now, years later, when I wake up at night and the room feels too dark, I swear I can sense them standing just beyond some unseen boundary, watching, waiting, memorizing the shape of my life from the corner of the shadows. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the faint scrape of claws against old wood, patient, deliberate, reminding me they haven't forgotten. I moved out here for quiet, out beyond the ridges of the Appalachians, past the winding roads that cut through the hollers. There's a stretch of blacktop that feels like it leads to nowhere. Fog settles thick there, rolling across the asphalt like it has weight, pressing against the edges of the woods, and every night it seems to swallow the headlights of passing cars whole. At least once a week I started noticing him, a figure walking along the roadside, moving slowly, limping, swaying like the mist itself carried him. At first, I assumed he was some lost traveler, or a local who had a habit of wandering after dark. But after a few weeks I began to feel something else. Something patient, deliberate, and unsettling. The first time I really paid attention, I was leaving the house late one evening. The fog had been rolling in for hours, thick enough that my porch light barely reached the mailbox. I squinted down the road and caught the flicker of a shadow. A man, though the shape seemed stretched and disproportionate, moving with a kind of rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand on end. His limp was slow, deliberate, like he was measuring each step against the fog. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I'd been sitting alone too long, letting the quiet crawl under my skin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just walking. He was watching, and that the fog around him wasn't mist at all, but something he carried with him. It happened again 2 nights later. I caught the figure from my porch, a faint silhouette trudging along the shoulder. I could just barely make out the tilt of his head, the swing of his arms. I thought of pulling out my binoculars, but didn't. I didn't want to see too much. There was something about his presence that felt wrong. Not violent, but invasive, like stepping into your house without touching a single thing. By the 3rd week, I'd memorized his pattern. Every 5 or 6 nights, just after midnight, he would appear. Always in the same place. Always with that same limping, swaying gait. It didn't matter if the fog was thick or thin. He was there. And I began to notice the small things that made the hair on my neck prickle. The headlights didn't always pass him evenly. Sometimes they seemed to hesitate, as if the night itself were giving him space. One evening, I made a decision I regret to this day. It was a fog-heavy night, the kind where the woods seemed to lean in, holding their breath. I climbed into my truck, reasoning that maybe he needed help. Maybe he was hurt. Maybe someone had to do something. I rolled down the window a crack and waited. The fog was thick enough to dampen sound, and the only thing I heard was the slow scuff of his boot against the gravel. When he looked up at me, I froze. His eyes were wrong. Not in a supernatural way. Not glowing. Not inhuman. Just too dark, too deep, too knowing. Like they could see everything I had ever done or everything I might ever do. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I opened the door for him and he stepped in without a word. No nod, no thanks, no greeting. He just sat, still, staring out the window like he could hear something the fog was hiding. I felt the weight of the silence settle over the cab. My knuckles whitened on the wheel. I drove. Slowly. Trying not to meet his eyes. Trying not to imagine what he was thinking. Or if he was thinking at all. The radio was off. I tried small talk once, asking if he needed a ride somewhere. Nothing. He just stared forward, tilting his head slightly every so often. I realized. I was imagining shapes in the fog behind him. Trees looked like tall men. Branches like arms. Shadows like faces. My pulse kept time with the rhythm of the road under the tires. When I reached the next town, I expected him to step out. I expected him to disappear into a streetlight or a side road. But I didn't notice until the truck was empty. No sound, no movement, no figure. The passenger door was wide open, and a cold draft rolled through the cab. I didn't try to close it at first. I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at the empty seat, trying to convince myself I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. But I had. I knew I hadn't. He'd been there. I'd felt it, the presence in the truck, the pressure of his gaze on the back of my neck. I didn't tell anyone. Nobody would believe it. And if I did tell someone, I feared they'd dismiss it, or worse, think I was losing my mind. So I kept it to myself. I drove home that night, careful, watching the stretch of road in my headlights, half expecting to see him walking alongside, waiting for another ride. He wasn't there. The fog swallowed everything again. But he returned. The following week, just as I had learned to anticipate, he appeared again. Same stretch. Same gait. The sway. The limp. I'd stopped trying to approach him. I kept my truck inside the garage at night. I stayed off the road entirely. I even considered putting up lights along the driveway, trying to push the fog and the figure away. But the fog doesn't care about lights. It moves slow, and it fills spaces where you think nothing can be. He moves with it. Sometimes I would hear him before I saw him. The scuff of a boot over gravel. A rhythm that was almost but not quite human. Sometimes I would glimpse him out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape at the edge of the road, watching, limping, patient. He never waved. Never called out. Never moved toward the house. Just waited. Listening. Studying. The air around him seems colder somehow. He doesn't need to touch you to leave his presence behind. Once I tried to catch him in a photograph. I left my camera on the porch, shutter set to the road, hoping to capture a fleeting glimpse. When I reviewed it the next day, there was nothing. Not a figure. Not a shadow. Just fog. Thick, rolling fog. I can't explain it. I tried again another night, and the same. Even the images of the fog seemed unnatural, like the air itself was denser where he walked. That presence doesn't leave a trace, except in the memory of the observer, the one unfortunate enough to look too long. After that, I stopped driving at night entirely. I told myself it was safer. I told myself it was healthier. But it didn't matter. He persisted. I would see him at a distance when the fog was heavy, limping along that same stretch, drifting, patient. It became a part of the landscape, as if the mountains themselves had conjured him to patrol the road, and I was merely someone who noticed. I began to dread the nights, the ones where the wind was still and the fog crawled in from the holler. I began locking doors early, sleeping with windows shut, hoping to keep the distance between us intact. But I knew deep down that distance was an illusion. Some nights I can still see him in the fog. Sometimes he is closer than I remember. Sometimes I wake to a sound on the porch, a scuff, a drag, a presence pressing against the edge of perception. The way he moves is subtle. It is quiet. It doesn't scream or demand attention, but it lodges itself into your awareness, like a cold memory you can't shake. I have stopped looking for reasons, explanations, answers. I don't try to rationalize anymore. I just feel the air thicken, the fog gather, and the faint sway of someone walking just beyond the edge of light. And there's something worse than seeing him, worse than feeling the presence, the knowledge that he is patient, that he will wait. He will always be there, always just beyond the reach of headlights and certainty. He doesn't need to touch you to mark your life. He only needs to exist in the periphery, a living shadow in the fog. That is enough. I never drove at night again after that first encounter. I don't leave the house after dark if I can help it. But even now, when fog creeps over the hollow, I can feel the weight of that figure moving along the shoulder, limping, swaying. He waits. He listens. And I know with a bone-deep certainty that one day I might see him again, closer than ever, still silent, still patient, still knowing. I didn't have much when I moved into that old stone house on the outskirts of town. It sat half sunk into the hillside, the kind of place that held cold even in the summer. Locals had warned me it was drafty, that the walls didn't keep sound well, that the place remembered more than it should. Whatever that meant, I brushed it all off as small-town superstition, the kind people pass around to give an old building some mystique. But they weren't wrong about the drafts. The house made strange sounds the minute the wind shifted. Groans through the beams, soft warps in the old foundation, and little breaths of air that slipped through cracks you couldn't see even with a flashlight. I told myself the murmurs I heard at night were just the wind squeezing itself through the stone joints. Houses settle. Pipes echo. Air moves. I repeated it like a mantra even when something inside me tightened at the thought of being alone with those sounds. At first, the whispers were faint, like someone speaking through a wall 2 rooms away. Just the rise and fall of something conversational. I'd be sitting at the kitchen table reading, and I'd catch a sound that made me pause. Something too rhythmic, too deliberate to be the wind. But whenever I stood up to listen, the house fell still again. Silence has a strange weight in the mountains. It presses against you until you start to imagine noise where there isn't any. Or at least that was what I tried to convince myself. It took about a month before I caught something distinct. I was in bed, barely drifting toward sleep, when the whisper slid through the darkness like someone leaning close to my ear. I sat up so fast the old mattress spring shrieked. I held my breath waiting. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the night bugs and a faint drip in the bathroom sink. I lay back down telling myself it was a dream, but I knew better. There was something about the timbre. Soft, yet intentional. Words trying to form. The whispers never happened when someone else was around. Friends visited once in a while, bringing food or beer, but the house behaved for them. It felt almost resentful of their presence, as if it were waiting for them to leave. And every time the front door closed behind a visitor, the house seemed to exhale. The murmurs always started small, late at night, growing clearer only when the world around me quieted down. It wasn't long before the sounds grew sharper. Conversations I couldn't quite make out, like multiple voices overlapping. Sometimes they rose and fell in sync with my footsteps, following me through the halls. Sometimes the whispers would go quiet the moment I stopped moving, as if they were aware of me listening. Once, while brushing my teeth, I froze mid-rinse because I heard my name, clear as a bell, spoken from the hallway behind me. I spun around, water dripping down my chin, but the hall was empty. The air, though, felt disturbed, like something had just passed through. After that, sleeping became nearly impossible. Every night the whispers grew more urgent, more precise. Words started taking shape, though never fully. Fragments. Half-thoughts. Breaths disguised as warnings. I'd lie on my side, staring at the wall, listening with that tense anticipation you get when you know something is about to reveal itself. The voices pressed in more sharply some nights, crawling through the mortar in the walls. Sometimes they sounded close enough that I could have sworn someone was standing right outside my bedroom door. The first phrase I understood struck me so deeply my chest seized. It came around 3 in the morning, when the house felt suffocatingly still. I was drifting in that uneasy place between sleep and waking when the words crawled out from the wall behind my headboard. They see you. Not one voice. Several. Layered over each other. Whispered with a kind of warning that made me feel like someone had snapped a branch in the darkness just to alert me. I didn't sleep after that. I remember sitting up with my back pressed to the opposite wall, staring into the shadows of the room while the little tremors of cold crept up my spine. I tried to explain it away for days. Stress, dreams, imagination. But every night the whisper returned, repeating the same phrase in the same low cadence. They see you. And every time it happened, I had the feeling I wasn't alone inside that house, like the walls were less structure and more observers. 2 nights later, I caught the second phrase. This one came from the living room as I walked past, my hand brushing the stone surface. The words were sharper, almost urgent. Don't go outside. I froze. Something in the tone made my breath turn shallow. It wasn't pleading. It was warning. As if whatever was whispering knew something I didn't. I didn't go outside that night. In fact, I pushed the deadbolt twice and leaned a chair against the door like I hadn't done since childhood. But the house didn't reassure me. If anything, the whispers bled through the walls more frequently. Faint mutters as I passed each room. Heavy breaths at the corners of the hallway. I tried to write it all down once, make sense of it on paper, but the words looked ridiculous under the lamp's light. How do you explain the feeling that stone walls are watching you breathe? There was a point where I should have left. Packed a bag, walked out the door, and driven until the mountains were behind me. But the strange thing about fear is how it can anchor you instead of pushing you away. Curiosity played its part. So did isolation. When you live alone long enough, you start to crave answers more than safety. And the house, God help me, it knew that. It fed on that curiosity piece by piece. One night, the whispers were sharper than they had ever been. I'd been dozing on the couch and something pulled me awake. Not a sound exactly, but the sudden sense of being summoned. The murmurs were coming from the far side of the house, down near the cellar door. I stood, heart pounding, and followed the faint overlapping voices. They fluttered like moth wings against the stone, growing louder the closer I got. The cellar door was closed, but the air around it felt wrong, colder, heavier, like it had been pulled from deep underground. The whispers rose and fell in a frantic rhythm, no longer faint or shy. They spilled from the cracks around the frame, too many to distinguish. I pressed my ear against the door and felt a vibration, like irregular breathing. Something in me said not to open it, but I did. The moment the latch clicked, a wave of frigid air smacked me in the face. The smell came next. Dampness, rot, something long closed in and forgotten. The voices didn't fade. They grew sharper, bouncing off the stone walls below. I switched on the cellar light, but it flickered, dim and useless, barely reaching the bottom of the stairs. I stood there, paralyzed, listening. The whispers rolled around me, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel their urgency, like they were trying to tell me something important, or keep me from something deeper. I didn't go down. I shut the door slowly, as if afraid the whispers would slip out if I moved too quickly. Even after the latch clicked into place, the murmurs stayed at the edge of hearing for hours, like the voices hovered just on the other side. I left the house the next morning. I didn't pack much, just a bag and my keys. I told myself I would come back once I understood things better, once I'd slept somewhere that didn't listen to me breathe. But even now, months later, when I close my eyes, I swear I can still feel the walls of that house pressing in. Still hear the whispers tucked behind my thoughts. They never left. Not really. It's as if the stone learned my name, learned my rhythms, learned how I listened. Sometimes, when the world around me is quiet and the night settles in just right, I catch a faint murmur. Soft, close, almost conversational. I tell myself it's my imagination. But a part of me knows the truth. The walls keep their records. And some houses don't forget the people who listen. I never minded the quiet when I moved into that part of town. The streets were narrow, lined with older homes that leaned into themselves like they were holding secrets, and most people kept to their yards or their porches. My neighbor's yard was the largest on the block, empty of anything but a lawn that stretched back toward the tree lane and at the far edge an old swing set. Rusted and pitted. The metal frame groaned under its own age, the chains rattling faintly even when the wind was barely there. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the weather, the way the evening breeze could make metal sing. But then I began noticing it moving when the air was still, and the quiet became unbearable. The first time I saw it, I was looking out my kitchen window late one summer night. I had stayed up too long, reading by lamplight, and the streetlights were throwing long yellow puddles across the asphalt. Something caught my eye, a gentle sway, slow and deliberate. The swing moved back and forth as if someone had just pushed off from it, but no one was there. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light or fatigue settling into my brain. When I blinked, it stopped. I told myself it was nothing, that swings don't move on their own. And yet, the thought lingered, heavy and insistent, like the metal itself had remembered someone who had long since left. I started documenting it. I set my phone on the kitchen counter, taking pictures through the window at odd hours, the kind of hours where the world feels half asleep, half dream. Most of the time, the images were empty. The swing, the yard, the creeping shadows of the trees. But a few showed something I couldn't explain. A shadow where there should have been none, the swing slightly off-center, caught mid-bob with no discernible push. I stopped showing the pictures to anyone. My friends would have laughed it off or asked me to sleep more. Out here, in these parts, people don't indulge curiosities like that. They shrug and keep walking, leaving things alone. And for a while I tried to do the same. Then came the night I saw him, or her, or whatever it was. I had been up late, again, unable to sleep. The air had a dampness to it, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes every creak of wood sound louder than it should. I leaned against the window, coffee cooling in my hand, and there it was. The swing moved back and forth, and on it sat a figure. I froze. The shape was human, backlit by the dim streetlight across the road, but it was unnervingly still, almost statuesque, yet somehow alive. The body was upright, hands gripping the chains, legs dangling slightly, moving with the rhythm of the swing. I tried calling out, my voice cracking mid-word. "Hello." I whispered louder, but the sound died in my throat. My hands shook, and when I blinked, the figure was gone. The swing still moved, swaying slowly, as if my very presence had been a signal for it to continue. I stepped closer to the window, heart hammering. The grass beneath it glistened with dew I hadn't noticed before. I don't know if the dew had been there all along or if it had appeared with the figure. The detail lodged itself in my memory, unnerving me more than the shadow ever could. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring out into the yard, listening to the faint creaks of metal and the occasional rustle of leaves. Sometimes the swing would move on its own, and I would swear I caught the silhouette again, lingering at the edge of my vision, just beyond the trees. I convinced myself it was a neighbor, some kid playing pranks, but that didn't fit. The yard was empty, and the swing seemed deliberate. Each movement was measured, not random. It followed a rhythm I couldn't quite understand. The nights stretched on. I began timing my check-ins, sitting at the window at the same hour each night, trying to see if there was a pattern. The swing moved most frequently around 2 a.m., but not always. Sometimes it didn't move at all for hours, leaving me staring into the shadows until exhaustion forced me to pull the curtains closed. And when it did move, I could swear I felt a presence, like someone was sitting there watching, listening, aware of me observing. I stopped turning on the porch light. The glare felt intrusive, as if shining a light on it would make it vanish or worse, anger it. I took more pictures. I documented every night, every swing, every shadow. The images were mostly unremarkable, until the night I caught the figure again. In the photo it was clear, a faint silhouette, upright, hands gripping the chains, back straight. The light behind it made no sense. There was nothing there in real life when I leaned against the glass. No sound, no footsteps, just the swing moving gently on its own. I showed one picture to a friend, half expecting him to laugh. Instead, he just stared at it. I could see it in his eyes, the unspoken question, "What did you see?" And I realized I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't want to. After that, I began hearing sounds at night. Not knocks or creaks from the house, but the subtle squeak of metal, the low rhythm of the swing moving when the wind was still. Sometimes I would swear I heard whispers carried on the breeze, faint and almost conversational. I never went outside at those hours, and yet the sounds persisted. They pressed into my skull, low and insistent, enough to keep me awake even with the lights on. One night, the culmination of fear and curiosity overtook me. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The yard was empty. The air smelled of dew and earth, cool and damp. I approached the swing slowly, every nerve in my body taut. The swing moved as I got closer, the chains creaking softly. And then I saw the figure. Not a full body this time, just the impression of it, a dark shape molded by shadow and light, sitting upright and still, waiting. I froze, unsure whether to retreat or step closer. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just existed, and that existence was heavier than anything I'd experienced before. I called out again, this time stronger, braver, but my voice seemed swallowed by the night. The shape dissolved in the corner of my eye, vanishing before I could blink. The swing continued its motion as though nothing had happened, and the dew beneath it gleamed faintly in the flashlight beam. I stumbled back toward the house, chest tight, breathing uneven. I didn't sleep again that night, or the next. I left soon after, packed what I could, left the window open one last time, and drove away without looking back. But even now, long after the move, I dream of it sometimes. The swing moving slowly in the fog, the faint silhouette, impossibly still yet alive. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, when I close my eyes, I can hear the creak of metal and feel that same weight pressing just beyond the edges of perception. There are some neighbors and some things you never fully understand. You watch from a distance, you document, you try to rationalize. And yet, when the night is heavy and the wind doesn't stir, you know it was there, waiting, patient, and that memory, more than anything, sticks with you. It presses into your mind in the quiet hours, a reminder that some presences are best left alone, some questions better unasked. The swing set remains in my dreams, swaying gently, and sometimes I feel as though it remembers me, just as I remember it, back and forth, quietly, endlessly. The fog here has a way of moving that feels deliberate, almost sentient, sliding down the holler like it has something to hide, or something to show. I first noticed it on an evening when the sun had long since dipped behind the ridges, leaving only that gray wash that softens everything it touches. I was walking the familiar path that follows the creek, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, when shapes began forming in the mist. At first, I thought they were trees or rocks, tricks of the low light, but then I saw them clearly. Faces half-formed and distorted, staring at me from within the fog. Hollow eyes, mouths frozen mid-expression, shifting as if caught between one thought and the next. I blinked and they vanished, but the unease stayed with me, pressing at my ribs, whispering that the holler had more witnesses than I had ever noticed. The next evening, the fog returned, heavier this time, curling along the creek and spilling into the small clearing near my cabin. I didn't want to see the shapes again, yet curiosity drew me out. I kept my distance, walking along the perimeter where the trees broke the edge of the valley, and sure enough, the faces were there, closer, testing how far I would let them approach. I could almost feel their gaze drilling into me, cold and patient. Each time I looked away, I sensed movement, a shifting just at the corner of my vision. Whispers, too, began to accompany the shapes. Soft, unintelligible at first, like wind chimes caught in a breeze. Then fragments of words. My name, names of places I had never mentioned, things I had only thought aloud when I was alone. I stopped, heart hammering, telling myself it was only my imagination, a product of the fog and the isolation that came with living out here. But it wasn't imagination. The fog doesn't need permission. The faces followed me night after night, appearing sooner, drifting closer, lingering when I froze in place. One evening, I tried to keep a journal, documenting what I saw and heard, hoping that writing it down would make it less real. But the faces didn't care for my notes. They moved behind the trees, reflected in the wet surfaces of the creek, sometimes so close that I could make out the contours of a cheekbone, the slope of a brow, the hollow pit where an eye should be. I began avoiding the paths after dusk, staying inside until the fog burned off, but even then, I couldn't escape the feeling of being observed. On nights when the fog was thickest, I would hear whispers carried on the cold, heavy air, teasing, taunting, naming things I had not spoken aloud. My own thoughts felt exposed, betrayed by the mist that seemed to know them. Sometimes I would see movement in the periphery, a flicker of shadow that mirrored my own steps. I tried calling out once, asking if anyone was there, if someone was playing a trick, but my words were swallowed by the fog. Silence answered, only the occasional faint shifting of shapes, confirming that I was alone, or that the company I kept was not human. The fear became familiar, creeping into the corners of my mind like the fog itself. I stopped walking after dark, stopped venturing to the creek, even avoiding the small clearing where the mist pooled thickest. Yet the faces found ways to appear, in morning fog when the sun was low, in the thin mist that clung to the valley before dawn. Hollow eyes followed me from shadows, and the weight of unseen attention pressed against my chest. The sense that I was being studied, catalogued, understood, and perhaps even judged became impossible to shake. I asked the older neighbors once about the fog, about the valley, and the strange shapes that sometimes appeared. They looked at me with the kind of quiet caution people use when discussing things best left unsaid. "Don't pay attention to it," one said. "Let it be and it'll leave you be." The words were simple, but their tone carried weight. I realized they knew more than they let on, that there were things in the holler that didn't answer to reason. I began to respect their silence, though my fear remained, simmering just beneath my attempts at composure. Over time, I became attuned to the fog. I could hear it rolling down the valley long before it reached me, smell its dampness in the air, feel its presence on my skin even when visibility was low. And always there were the faces. Always watching, waiting, patient. I never saw one fully, never clearly enough to understand what they were, but the implication was enough. They were aware. They were observing. They were part of the land, or perhaps the land itself had formed them. Eventually, I left that part of the holler. I moved closer to town, to somewhere safer, more illuminated. But the memory of the fog, of the faces emerging from it, followed me. On misty mornings, when the air is heavy and the valley is quiet, I sometimes see them in the thin clouds clinging to the hills. Hollow eyes peering, unnamed whispers brushing the edges of thought, reminding me that the world out there doesn't belong to me alone. Some presences, some watchers are patient. They endure long after we leave. Even now, I hesitate when fog rolls down valleys or clings to the holler. I slow my steps, glance to the edges of the mist, and feel the weight of eyes that never blink. The shapes are fleeting, distorted, impossible to hold on to, but the memory of them remains, and with it, the quiet dread of being observed in a place where I thought I could be alone. In these Appalachian hills, some neighbors aren't human at all, or at least not in ways we understand. And when the fog rolls in, you can feel them there, waiting, watching, patient, and impossible to shake.